Welcome to our webinar series, A Journey of Art and Storytelling with Panay Mythology in relation to its contemporary context and relation to other Asian mythologies. This webinar series is part of the Golden Realms Inheriting the Panay Sugidanun initiative, which aims to honor the Panay Sugidanun. ThriveArt Projects has been working on a manga adaptation of sections of the Sugidanun slated for release in December 2021 in both English and Japanese languages. Golden Realms Inheriting the Panay Sugidanun is a literary YOMU, which explores reading cultures in Asia at present. Let's all introduce our moderator for today, Mr. Eric Divinagracia, Artistic Director of the University of San Agustin Little Theater.
Good morning to everyone watching on Zoom and on our Facebook page. The mythology of indigenous folklore has inspired countless works of art and literature, and these works have in turn reached farther than ever before thanks to mass media and the internet. However, it's crucial to remember that it's important to give back to the very people who have sustained these stories for generations. In working with indigenous communities, you may have heard of the terms FPIC, IKSP, IPRA, or IPRA, and more. Today is a valuable opportunity to learn about what these terms truly mean in relation to intellectual property rights and indigenous peoples' rights from a representative of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, or NCIP, which serves as a mediating institution between people in indigenous communities as they work together on projects. To begin with, I'd like to share a message from a representative of the Panay Bukidnun indigenous people. Romulo Caballero is a member of the Panay Bukidnun Council of Elders and comes from a family of Sugidanun epic storytellers who have generously shared their chants with younger generations, including the team behind Golden Realms. It's our honor to share this video that Taimolok specially recorded for us with his monumental voice and rich storytelling.
Ako kali si Romulo Amangbaoy Caballero. Bali 75 years old ako paron. So well awarded, Search for Outstanding Indigenous People Leadership. Kag ako ang unong nga manunudlo sa School for Living Tradition. Isa lang ang School for Living Tradition diya sa ilog ng Panay. Ang mensahe ko lang sa kabataan na nagpamati, ang kultura nga diyang Sugidanan, ifit center, hindi ninyo pagkakaya kay kamaan kao. Amo dya ang binilin ka mga malap na mga manggat kaya sa Central Front ka Panay. Kaya gusto nanda na hindi matura. Sa IPDs naman sa 29, ang mensahe ko lang, hindi natin pagduraan dyan mga bagay kag didikaran din natin kaya na di parahan ka gobyerno pagtawaan kita kahigayunan nga may kaadlawan ang ating pagkatribo Panay Bukidnun. Ang mensahe ko lang sa salwa kanugon ang Sugidanan kung madura kain saman nakaduro nga seminar ginaturan ko sa Davao, sa Tagum City, sa Cordillera o amudaya ang ginasuggest namon ang parties ka School for Living Tradition. Anda toya sa gawi lang ka mga malam ng damo ang napanudlo nanda sa anda na SLT. Pero diya sa Panay, daw pana hanga si Kidlat kag si Dato Saway mana pinakadalom pagidya inyong tradisyon kay antes nga way pa magkurang kalayo naman aninyo kung sino'y mga tao amura gani nga daw nagauwiki dito kulit nga kumadura ko sa pinakadlaw nga hindi ka mga bata mapanukli kinahanglan antes ako magtaliwan sa kalibutan ibilin ko sa kabataan. Ang makuan ko lang, ma-advise ko lang, kung may mga drawing kamo, antes kamo nga magpagwa, kung di ninyo pagwaan, ipatsik tanay, kay basi magwa sa pinakadlaw na sala. Nagapasalamat din ako sa Japan Foundation kay diyan kanimo nag-agili sanda kay kung magdirekta sa taknamo ni mo salamat din sa pag-cover ng sing epic chapter. May mga dayan ako nga naobserbahan nga daw ginkuanan lang bala ginmoderno na lang pero way nagasunod sa dinumaan nga epic chapter gindugangan na lang hindi ako gusto kay ang Sugidanon hindi gusto mabuhinan hindi gusto madugangan kinahanglan kung amo ang ginapamunuan kag ano ang istorya amo lang na hindi pagpabulak-bulakan.
Naoy balao ganday dali ang datudugay dugay ang dali ang sugi dagmiteng sugi danen madali tol-tolanen kay puyong humadap nen adikono ay hay ay sumbol pagwayangan hulugi dot pinagsayop si dot sinalipit bataka tekasi singkuyang at kamanghiyan ise kayang bolawan isi dati oto tulud taga lumapaw pasanunton sa humbak patawsan sa daloyon sa lun takkan kalau den bilugan kalayagan mapaliked maobling si mungsad porola kau adikono ay iuhay idaguro huni niu tuturung gondol itlarano goni ginoong harang deni datong parang kuton sanglit paharong mamkaw sangdan bagong mangayaw danuk dana kay agong dupikalay karatong iwanen tarun lamang baling hawa dey hawa ketiku dey parang hagtan isumbol pag wayangan sa paggawe kabiday sa pagpaiwan iwan sa daladaheng selegan satu kareng beyekan warak payawing sola warahime repet kinahanenga adui pidai gapaleyan leyan dan sate ngate alalau dan sekaalang-alangan manganduk manganeneng simungsan porola kau ngagsunud deng paman wa antag deng paninen aninurihi kong teno bobagupong binalag barukiwat deleg warat dengan isakayang bolawan mala pitik lai tulong mala sarami samlang hitungat kabidai hitngat kabarangai ine bungangung bukit inak borong bentekeun metali wandang bidai masai ludang barangai hukiwat deleg warat dengan isakayang bolawan liput sali liputan loan saloloangan sanapulong likoan gatus ngalo loangan ngahitungeun ได้หิดเงิดกาบาราไงบึนตือเกินเดิงดาโพนานบุกิดงาก็เอ็มเบิงานาโนนาวอีปูนายนาเลงายImana ye nakat dalap dap lao de nakat dakai laya gen kesakai yang bola wan lambus ngakatoli nan mangande mangane neng kunina padang he panada padang Ohayan hadin marin balana geto adi parayong panaw ibuyong homadap nanit nagsalakay nagmam kau nagkapyo nag mangayaw hinden mangayengaya datu maligok-ligok sepunayan punayan simaramag nayan en karawanay patunggon.
Thank you, Tay Molok, for sharing an excerpt from the Sugidanun of Tarangban, which narrates the man of gold Bukidnun as he prepares to set sail on his journey. Tarangban is the cave where Bukidnun was seduced and then trapped by enchanted women. How he was saved by Nagmalitong Yawa is a thriller in itself. It's truly been an honor to listen to the Caballero chanters who are continuing the majestic tradition of the Sugidanun to the present. Artists and researchers who want to collaborate with indigenous groups must address a lot of ethical questions. For example, how are copyright and intellectual property determined when people make modern adaptations of indigenous oral practices? How should royalties be considered, be distributed among the indigenous community and the writer? What are the creative and legal negotiations between indigenous peoples and research? By the way, I'd like to remind everyone that if you have questions during the talk, please do not hesitate to send them through the chat box or comment, as we may address them later at the Q&A. Ultimately, let's all be thinking about how a healthy and mutually beneficial exchange between outsiders and indigenous peoples can be cultivated. These are some of the concerns our speaker today will discuss. It's my honor to introduce our speaker to share her expertise about indigenous peoples' rights and intellectual property rights. Attorney Mary Genevieve F. Tingson-Wuthrich is currently the Regional Hearing Officer of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples in Regions 6 and 7. She joined the Commission as a Provincial Legal Officer in February 2015. She is currently the lawyer involved with the Golden Realms as they negotiate our creative collaboration on the manga with the Panay Bukidnun community. Everyone, please welcome Attorney Mary Genevieve Tingson-Wuthrich.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us in this webinar, and we hope we could share with you the laws and the guidelines of the NCIP. I'll be discussing the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act and the Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices processes. Thank you. We hope at the end of this discussion, following questions. Who are the indigenous peoples? What is ancestral domain? What are the rights of indigenous peoples under the 4 bundles of rights? What is NCIP? What is IKSP? And the process in securing the certification precondition before you could start your research or documentation on the indigenous knowledge systems and practices. So, to better understand the concept of indigenous peoples, one has to go back to pre-colonial times, to where before Philippines was discovered by Magellan. So let's embark on an ipanaw or journey in the past. Next slide, please. So, before the arrival of the Spaniards, ancient Filipinos were living in scattered barangays and were ruled by different indigenous political structures. This indigenous political structure is basically a form of government and leadership. Next slide, please. So, our pre-colonial settlers live within a specified territory. They have their own boundaries. And they had existing customary laws that serve as their justice system. And they have their own indigenous political structure, which serve as their form of government. As such, each indigenous cultural community live like one nation. Next slide, please. Spanish colonizers fueled conflicts between the natives in the hinterlands and the lowlands as part of their strategy to divide and rule. And the majority learned the ways of the colonial rulers by adopting their laws, practices, and perspectives. And of course, the minorities live in the mountains and respective territories. There, they were able to continue as organized communities and were able to maintain possession of their territories, preserve their culture, identity, and political structure and determination. Next slide, please. Those who have maintained their indigenous political structure, the customary laws, and other distinctive cultural traits since pre-colonial times up to the present are now our indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. So these are important keywords to know who are really genuine indigenous peoples. First, they must have the homogeneous quality. No? There must be indigenous homogeneous group. They must share common bonds of language, customs, traditions, and other distinctive cultural traits. They must exist since time immemorial, that is before the Spanish period. And they have continuously, up to the present, have lived as organized community with their own indigenous political structure still intact, and that they have retained its culture and identity and became historically differentiated from the majority of the Filipino people. So how about ancestral domains? If the indigenous peoples and communities have retained their identity since time immemorial, the ancestral domains are the lands in possession of the indigenous peoples under the claims of ownership since time immemorial up to the present, without interruption, except during war, force majeure, or displacement by force, deceit, or threat, or as a consequence of government project. So these are the areas and territory belonging to the ICC's IP since time immemorial. It comprises of land, waters, and coastal areas. So unlike other lands that the DNR and DAR is lands that DNR and DAR are giving out, no? Not necessarily giving out, but they are titling. No? The ancestral domain is not limited to lands and inland. It involves inland waters and coastal areas, which the ICCs have traditional access to and which are necessary to ensure their economic, social, and cultural welfare. Next slide, please. So, after hearing the basic concepts, no, let's go to the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, no, or the Republic Act 8371, an act to recognize, protect, and promote the rights of indigenous cultural communities, indigenous peoples, creating the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, establishing mechanisms and appropriating funds therefore, and for other purposes. Next slide, please. So the IPRA has 4 purposes. First, to recognize, protect, and promote the rights of indigenous cultural communities and indigenous peoples, to establish implementing mechanisms to create the NCIP and appropriate funds for its implementation. Under the IPRA, next slide please, the ICC's IPs have 4 bundles of rights, 4 fundamental rights: the right to ancestral domains and land, the right to self-governance and empowerment, social justice and human rights, and cultural identity. Next slide, please. Under the right to ancestral domain, the ICCs, or the indigenous cultural communities, indigenous people, have the right to ownership, the right to develop lands and natural resources found therein, the right to stay in their territories, the right in case of displacement that they have to return to their ancestral domain if the situation becomes normal again, the right to regulate entry of migrants. Being owners of that land, they have the right to say no to migrants, and they have the right to be consulted, like the right to free and prior informed consent. They have the right to regulate entry of migrant settlers and organizations into the domains, the right to safe and clean air and water, the right to claim parts of reservations for as long as it's no longer used by the government, and the right to resolve conflict among themselves. Next slide, please. There's under the IPRA, there's a specific concept of ownership. It means that the indigenous concept of ownership generally holds that ancestral domains are the indigenous cultural communities, indigenous people's private but community property, which belongs to all generations and therefore cannot be sold, disposed, or destroyed. So this is a unique concept of ownership. The usual concept of ownership is that you can simply dispose or convey whatever thing you have. However, when it comes to ancestral domains and when it comes to indigenous people, you cannot simply alienate or dispose these properties because they belong to not only to you, but they belong to the whole community. And not only from this generation, but from all generations. And therefore, it cannot be sold and disposed or destroyed because it has to be preserved. The same with concept of ownership of the cultural property. Thank you. Next slide, please. Also, as I have said earlier, there is a need of free and prior informed consent before the conduct of any activity inside the ancestral domain. Violation of the free and prior informed consent process will render the entry and intrusion into the domain as unlawful and unauthorized, which is a prohibited act under the IPRA and is criminally punishable. Next slide, please. One of the rights of the indigenous peoples under the IPRA is the right to self-governance and empowerment. It is the right to use their own commonly accepted justice systems, conflict resolution institutions, peace-building processes or mechanisms, and other customary laws and practices within their respective communities, and as may be compatible with the national legal system and with internationally recognized human rights. So before any conflict will be referred to the courts or to the barangay, it has to be resolved within the community itself with its council of elders. And only after the council of elders have issued a resolution that they cannot resolve it on their own, that the case or the controversy will be referred to the courts or to the barangays. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the right to participate in decision-making process. The ICC's IPs have the right to participate fully, if they so choose, at all levels of decision-making in matters which may affect their rights, lives, and destinies through procedures determined by them, as well as to maintain and develop their indigenous political structure. As such, the state shall ensure that the ICC's IP shall be given a mandatory representation in policy-making bodies and other local legislative councils. We call them the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative in the local government units. So we have a separate guidelines on how to select the IPMR. Next slide, please. So social justice is a measure implemented by the government to uplift the lives of its less privileged citizens under the principle that those who have less in life should have more in law. The IPRA is a form of social justice to give more rights and privilege to the indigenous peoples who are the most vulnerable among the vulnerable sectors of our society. Under the human rights, the indigenous peoples have the right to equal protection and non-discrimination. Next slide, please. So under the right to cultural integrity, the state shall respect, recognize, and protect the rights of our indigenous peoples to preserve and protect their cultural traditions and institutions. It shall consider these rights in the formulation and application of national plans and policies. Next slide, please. So part of the right to cultural integrity is the right to indigenous knowledge systems and practices. The recognition of full ownership and control of their resources, seeds, traditional medicine, vital medicinal plants and animals and minerals, knowledge of the properties of the flora and fauna, oral traditions, literature, designs, and visual and performing arts. Next slide, please. So under that right, let's discuss the Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices and Customary Law Research Documentation Guidelines of 2012, which will guide us in securing the certification precondition from NCIP. So what is IKSP? It refers to systems, institutions, mechanisms, and technologies comprising a unique body of knowledge evolved through time that embody patterns of relationship between and among peoples and between peoples, their lands and resource environment that are direct outcome of the indigenous peoples. Why do we refer them as peoples? Because they are a group of nation. We don't just refer them as a group of people, but group of one group of nations. It includes social, political, cultural, and economic, religious peers, and responses to certain needs consisting of adaptive mechanisms which have allowed indigenous peoples to survive and thrive within their given socio-cultural and biophysical conditions. So basically, everything about indigenous peoples, their relationship, their role as their role in the family, their lives, it is part of the indigenous knowledge systems and practices. So the IKSP research is the gathering and analysis of data, information, and facts with the active and full participation of the indigenous cultural communities, indigenous peoples, their life ways for purposes of gaining knowledge and understanding for its advancement and enhancement, advocacy, basis for policy, plans and programs, decision-making, and for continuity and protection of cultural integrity. Next slide, please. So the IKSP, or the Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices, is a class of its own, like the ancestral domain, and it is the collective property of our indigenous community. And therefore, the author, the composer, inventor, writer, choreographer, arranger, lyricist, owner, first user, or preacher is not one individual, but all members of the community who belong to the past, present, and future generations. We've seen earlier, Taimulok, he sang the with this chant, no? So the chant of Taimolok is not only the intellectual property of Taimolok. It belongs to the whole community. And therefore, if we wish to have that documented, we have to secure the consent of the whole community, not only of Taimolok. That's the concept of IKSP. Next slide, please. So it is the ICC's or the Indigenous Cultural Communities' entitlement of recognition of full ownership and control and protection of their cultural and intellectual rights. Therefore, they have the right to reject, allow, or accept the research and documentation of their IKSP or customary laws in their derivatives through free and prior informed consent. Next slide, please. So the guidelines include the following researches: the community-initiated or solicited researches, academic researches, researches in aid of policy, social researches, and even researches necessary to implement the mandates of the NCIP. Next slide, please. So this is our process. Just a short discussion on this. First, you have to file an application and pay the fees before the NCIP. The fee is 500 pesos. And your application with your research proposal will be reviewed and evaluated by the Technical Management and Surveys Division Chief with the help of the Regional Legal Officer. If it is insufficient, it will be remanded to the applicant for compliance. If it is sufficient, the Regional Director will create the IKSP team, and the IKSP team will give notice to the concerned community and to the applicant. And then we will meet for the work and financial plan for the applicant to know how much is he going to spend for the entire process, because we will be going to the community not only once, but twice or thrice. And then after that, we will conduct a conference wherein the applicant will fully disclose his research or film or any activity that he's going to conduct involving the indigenous knowledge systems and practices. After the disclosure, we will leave the indigenous cultural community to decide whether to accept or reject the application. If they choose to reject, they will issue a resolution of non-consent. But if they accept the application, they will issue a resolution of consent. The resolution of consent, after that, if there will be other conditions or if there will be no conditions, we will execute the memorandum of agreement as to how and when and what will be covered by the research. And after that, the team will make a report to the regional director. It will be reviewed by the regional legal officer and the TMSD. And if found sufficient and in accordance with the process, the guidelines, the regional director will issue the certification precondition. The issuance of the certification precondition attests to the fact that the free and prior informed consent was given by the community in accordance with law. And you may now conduct your research. After conducting the research or your film or any activity, you will present the output for validation to make sure that whatever data you have gathered is in accordance with the customs and traditions of the community. So we will present it to the community to validate the information and data gathered. And if it is in accordance with their customary, the customs and traditions, then they will issue a certificate of validation. And now you may submit your output to the community and to NCIP and to your school. And Yes, next slide, please. And after which, no, I would like to clarify that the certification precondition is not does not cover the publication of the output. There must be a separate consent for that. We will discuss later. So the exception to the process that I have explained earlier are research and documentations in aid of delineation and titling of the ancestral domains and lands conducted by NCIP, because this is governed by Administrative Order Number 1 Series of 2020, wherein it is the community itself that files for the application. So there's no need for the FPIC process or the IKSP process. Still, there is consent, no? Research and documentations in aid of the Ancestral Domain Sustainable Development and Protection Plan, because it is governed by Administrative Order Number 1 Series of 2004, and it's still subject to the consent of the community, only that there's a different process for this. And biological and genetic prospecting and commercial researches, which is governed by Administrative Order Number 3 Series of 2012, which has a more lengthy process. So next slide, please. So let's go to ownership rights. No? The rights to research and documentations, whether published or unpublished, shall rightfully belong to, first, the community, whether initiated, solicited, or conducted by the community themselves, undertaken within or affecting the ancestral domain. So if it is the member of the community who will conduct the process, the ownership right shall belong to the community, without mentioning specifically the researcher who is a member of the community. Next, the community and the research proponent jointly. For researches or documentations conducted by non-members of the community, undertaken within and affecting the community concerned and or its ancestral domain. So I believe this research fall under that category, and that they have joint rights to all works and materials resulting from such research, whether or not the same is published or communicated in any medium. So if you will have an adaptation also, it will be subject to property rights also of the concerned indigenous peoples. And in the event that the research or documentation output are sought to be protected by the research proponent, such copyright shall involve the community concerned in the said research or documentation. Next slide, please. The publication. The community shall have the sole and exclusive right to determine the extent, content, or manner of presentation of the information or knowledge that may be published or communicated if the research output pertains to their religious, cultural beliefs, and ceremonial paraphernalia or sites. Such determination must be clearly outlined in the Memorandum of Agreement. Next slide, please. Before a research can be published, first, there must be a certificate of validation, and that the researcher must provide a translation of his or her major findings and recommendations, as well as the pertinent research documentation to the indigenous cultural community concerned, who shall have the right to comment or to correct factual data. Next slide, please. So these are mandatory benefits of the indigenous peoples. They are entitled to the final research output. The researcher shall furnish the community a copy of the final and approved version of the research output. And they're also entitled to royalty if the work, the output will derive income. So the community shall have a share in a form of royalty. Which should be subject to negotiation of how much the royalty should be. So it will be subject also of the memorandum of agreement. User fees. This fee is due from commercial users of various IKSPs or unprotected materials that are not subject to copyright or any derivative thereof. So if you're just going to use it one time and it's not really for, it does not really earn income, but you're just going to use it, they're still entitled to user fees. And our indigenous peoples can also receive other benefits that redound to their own, the benefit of the entire community. Non-monetary forms that are acceptable to parties should be explored. Next slide, please. There's exception to the process and to the above requirement on mandatory benefits. It shall not apply to researches undertaken by pupils and high school students to complete requirements for subject courses or in finishing basic education. Anyway, those researches are not that detailed. Next slide, please. So sanctions. Failure to comply with the terms and conditions of their agreements and violation of any provision of the guidelines shall be subject to the following sanctions without prejudice to the filing of criminal, civil, and administrative proceedings as the case may be. Violation by the IP community shall be penalized in accordance with the customary law of the community, while violation committed by the researcher shall constitute a ground for the termination of the research activity. An order of termination shall be issued by the regional director after due notice and hearing, and violation committed by NCIP officers and employees shall subject him or her to administrative liability. Next slide, please. So the NCIP is the primary government agency responsible for the formulation and implementation of policies, plans, and programs to promote and protect the rights and well-being of our indigenous cultural communities, indigenous peoples, and the recognition of their ancestral domains as well as their rights thereto. Next slide, please. So the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples shall implement the IPRA. It has 7 commissioners who are all indigenous peoples, members of indigenous people. They are all appointed by the president and shall hold office for a term of 3 years. They represent the 7 ethnographic regions all over the Philippines. And they're headed by a chairperson. Our chairperson right now is Secretary Alan A. Capuyan of Mindanao. So the NCIP is mandated to protect and promote the interests and well-being of our indigenous peoples with due regard to their belief, customs, traditions, and institutions. As such, it shall serve as the primary government agency responsible for the formulation and implementation of pertinent and appropriate policies, plans, and programs to carry out the policies set forth in the IPRA. Next slide, please. That's all. Thank you very much. And in behalf of our Regional Director, Augusto B. Maglungsod, we are very grateful for inviting us and for giving us the opportunity to share with you our guidelines and the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Happy Indigenous Month to everyone. Thank you.
And to you too, Madam, mga salamat. Thank you, Attorney Mary Genevieve Tingson-Wuthrich. Attorney, there are so many people asking so many questions. Indeed, you have touched a nerve and perhaps a good one as we explore the realms of our ancestors. You mentioned that we are in an e-Panaw, we are journeying to the past. And it looks like an Panaw in Hiligaynon is to move, to travel. And it seems that we are traveling electronically. We're traveling virtually, e-Panaw, no? But more importantly, from the past, we move forward to the present. From the roots, we go to new routes of expression, because that's what we're going to ask today. And there are indeed many questions for you. If that's okay, Attorney, there are so many questions that we'd like to ask you. So first off,
yes, sir.
But before I do ask questions, may I just acknowledge the presence of Taimunok's grandson, Jufel Ray Caballero. Jufel, maayong aga sa imo. Now, attorney, the question from our panel of like comics, for example, to be made based on indigenous IP or intellectual property? Yes.
Yes, thank you. No, this is the first time that I've heard that there is going to be an adaptation of the indigenous culture and the indigenous literary to be manga.
Yes.
Yes,
Manga.
yes. So this is the first time, but there are other adaptations of the literary arts of our indigenous peoples. But this is the first time that I've
Yes.
heard.
So that's very
And thank
interesting
you
when we adapt
Yes,
this to
very.
manga eventually. So there have
Yes.
been other translations or iterations like maybe film or even theater, no? But not yet comics or in particular manga. Now, this is a question from Gay Jalsita, who's joining us in this forum. Entrepreneurs and artists often violate indigenous people's rights by copying their designs. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Now, what can be done to assure part of these sales go back to the indigenous community group where the design originated from?
It's unfortunate, no, that there are a lot of people who violated the rights of our indigenous people, partly because they are unaware of these rights, no? And that for us, of course, since the act has been done, we would like some conciliation, and we're open, no, that this be corrected. Our indigenous peoples, they are very generous to us, and sometimes they don't complain. It's NCIP that's been complaining for in their behalf, no?
Right.
And to avoid criminal and civil actions, we can go back to the community and secure the free and prior informed consent. Although it's been done, but we can have a compromise on if we can first let's present the output, let's secure the consent of the community, let's validate that output if it's correct, and then if the community will allow it, we can have the memorandum of agreement, and we'll have the sharing of the royalty.
Right. So you mentioned there are criminal and civil liabilities if they transgress the IP rights?
Yes, sir. It's provided for in the IPRA. And we could also ask that the particular research be be invalidated for the violation of indigenous people's rights.
Right. So another question, how might foreign individuals or institutions negotiate with NCIP for research on IKSP? Who are these parties accountable to?
Thank you. No, that's a nice question, because we all know that the Philippines will have no jurisdiction on people outside its territory. And
Right.
therefore, what we require is that if you are a foreign national and living outside the Philippines, you must have a representative who is a Filipino. So, and he's living here, so that the Philippines can have jurisdiction over your representative.
With that person, the representative.
Yes. But of course, you will be part of that, no?
Right.
Because it's hard to implement orders and judgments outside our territorial jurisdiction.
Right. Is international law cognizant of this? Is there, do you have knowledge whether or not across the borders we can still protect our IP rights?
Of course.
Foreign nationals?
Yes, you have the United Nations. In fact, we are one of the countries who are actively implementing the rights of the indigenous peoples. However, it's difficult compared to implementing our laws within our own territory.
Right, right. Thank you very much, Attorney. Here's from a question from an anonymous participant. No? So the current process, we look at the work process flow. No, it looks like it's very challenging. No, how do you make the FPIC process more efficient so that more researchers could be encouraged to undertake projects with IP and contribute to the heritage cycle? Or baka, on my own perspective, baka is this one way also to prevent or discourage researchers to do research on the IP? That's why it's so difficult.
Understand, no, it's one it's actually usually is the complaint of our of the applicants, no, but we have to take into consideration that our IPs, most of them, they are not really that educated like us. And we have to exert more effort, no, and time, and give them more time to digest, no, and understand all this. That's why we have to go to the community. We have to explain the research fully, completely, no,
Right.
and we must give them time because they will have consultation also.
Right.
They will be consulting, not only this will be the decision not only of the elders and leaders but the whole community. So
Right.
we must give them time. But what we do to hasten the proceedings is that, for example, this day we'll have the community consultation, no?
Right.
And if the community decides that the following day they are ready to give their decision, then we respect that, and we conduct the next process the following day or the next activity. But we cannot force our community. We must give them time, and that we are also looking to amend, no, our FPIC processes to
Right.
adapt to the present situation, especially during this pandemic where
Right.
it's difficult to gather.
Mhm.
So we are
Correct.
currently making amendments and revisions to our guidelines, and we are very thankful for your inputs and your information on this so that we can consider that. Thank you.
Did the pandemic affect any of our processes? I mean, right off the bat, is there an impact to how we are tapping into our IPs, especially because there is a degree of isolation, no, because of the pandemic?
Yes, sir. It greatly affected our processes, especially that most of our processes require community validation and
Right.
community participation. So
Right.
it's difficult, especially that in our ancestral domains, our indigenous peoples are residing in the mountainous areas where there's no
Right.
signal.
Yes,
But there's,
connectivity becomes a
yes.
major issue, no?
And
Right.
the technology, it's hard for indigenous peoples to use our technology.
Correct.
And it's hard also to explain on our part for our indigenous peoples. So there are delays in the processes, and we're working on it. No? Admittedly, there are delays, but rest assured that NCIP is working on how to adapt and cope up with the pandemic.
Right. Thank you very much, Attorney. Many of those who are attending our panel today are artists, researchers, no, creatives, no. And here's a question from Brian Liao of Viva Excon Antique. Attorney Genevieve, what is the procedural requirements or steps of courtesy to invite an elder to share his knowledge in the lowlands? Is there a permit needed to be asked from the NCIP?
Sir, no? So as we discussed earlier, it is still covered by IKSP. even if it's just his experience, because his experience is an experience of him being an member of the indigenous peoples. So that experience, although that's personal to him, it has some community related knowledge systems and practices, which you have to secure really the FPIC and our IKSP through that process that we showed earlier. But case to case, in case to case basis, sir, no, there are
Right.
communities that really welcome, and they are willing to have shorter period in securing the consent, and we respect that because we understand the difficulty.
And speaking about the processes, no, this is from Aurora Imanaga. In the flow chart of the application for conduct of research, how long would the whole application process be completed? I understand, like what you said earlier, that sometimes it's a case-to-case basis. No, for example, the indigenous community will just approve it a day before you present it to them, or after rather you present the case to them. But in your experience, how long would it usually take?
There
Particularly the
are
conduct of research.
yes, there are cases wherein we have 2 weeks. We already can issue the certification precondition, but there are cases where we lasted for months, depending on the process, because there are also applicants who probably lost their interest and have rescheduled our activities. But our also our predicament also is that we are rendering services for region 6, 7, and 8, not only for region 6. And there we only have 6 community service field offices here in region 6, while two field offices in region 7. 3 regional so 5 here in region 6, and in each community service center or field office we only have 7 to 9 employees working for the whole, like we have Iloilo and Guimaras. For the whole Iloilo and Guimaras province, we have only one community service centers with only 7 personnel. And if we are not really bombarded, we have a lot of applications. We cannot really schedule them simultaneously. We have to do that, and we have to. And it's not the only work that NCIP have. No, we have other services, and with only few people working on these processes, we have to reschedule. If you reset your schedule, then you have to wait for another week or
because
2
there are
weeks.
other researches that are already pending in terms of application.
Yes.
So can you give us attorney, a ballpark figure, like based on the past 10 or 20 researches that have been conducted, what's the shortest and what's the longest period of application for research?
The shortest probably is 2 weeks. No,
2 weeks.
where we can have the report with the CD and the memorandum of agreement or completed. No, the longest probably I cannot tell because there are IKSP researches. Yes, that are still there. No, I don't know what happened to that. Probably they lost interest and did not process. So we have applications that are still pending for years. It's just there.
So it
Unless
can be
we
2
terminate
weeks
it.
to time immemorial.
But just in case, but if we are strict about it, if you lost interest, we can terminate the process.
Right. Hindi naman talaga time immemorial.
Yeah, we can terminate. But we're just being lax probably without terminating it, so that the applicant can go back to us and say, can I continue my process? So, okay.
Thank you very much, Attorney. Now, another question from one of our participants here, from Mia Reyes. Now, if an artist purchased a clothing sold by an indigenous community, is it okay if an artist conducts a photo shoot of a model wearing the said clothing? So perhaps the model is not an IP, but just wearing the let's say the panubok, no, of the indigenous from the Panay Bukidnun, or any clothing for that matter. Then exhibit the creative work based on the model wearing the indigenous clothing. Is it subjected to NCIP? So let me repeat that. No, if an artist purchased a clothing sold by an indigenous community, is it okay if an artist conducts a photo shoot? So number one, a photo shoot with a model wearing the said clothing. Number two, exhibit the creative work based on the model wearing the indigenous clothing, and of course, whether all of this is subject to NCIP.
I'll just give my legal opinion, no, on that.
Yes, Attorney.
I believe it's not okay. No, you can purchase, you can wear it since you purchase it, but having a photo shoot, no, and exhibiting it is a different thing, because if you photo shoot and the intellectual property rights would come in,
Right.
no, because first you cannot claim the rights now as the owner of that, because the item that you shot doesn't belong to you, and that you could wear it differently, not in
Right.
accordance with the customs and traditions of the indigenous peoples. And usually our indigenous peoples are very sensitive. It is for
Right.
them, it's not a costume, or no, it's their attire. It's sacred, their clothing that they have. So wearing it, to wear it, and where you have no right to wear it, is some kind of an insult to them. I have heard some indigenous members of indigenous people complaining about that. So that's why, like me, I am not an IP, and there are times when we have to have when we have some occasions where we are asked to wear something that is traditional. So we'll just wear a traditional IP accent, like looks like IP, but actually it's not really IP, because on my part I cannot wear the attire of the indigenous peoples, not being a member thereof. Thank you.
So if I buy an outfit from them, or a dress from them, I can wear it on public. Can I wear it on a public function or in a public function? Or do I have to ask permission from NCIP or the indigenous community? Or, that means, syempre, if I buy a dress, no, that means I will be wearing it. So will that be okay for me to wear it in an official function, or maybe even post it on my profile pic in Facebook? Is that okay? Or do I need to consult with anybody else?
So far, we have no complaints, no, about that, because anyway, it's the indigenous peoples. They sell it. They sell it.
Right.
So you being the so far we have none, and parang hindi man siya regulated.
Right.
We are just regulating the patterns, the commercial use of that, because we have
Right.
fake textiles.
Right.
There are fake textiles imitating the pattern of
Right. So it's the commercialization that you're protecting.
yes.
Right.
Yeah, but the personal use we are not so
Okay.
far
And
regulated.
maybe that's the reason why you buy these clothes, because you want to wear them and you're proud wearing them, no? Now,
Proud of our ancestry.
yes, indeed. An anonymous participant here asking the question: how much should a researcher prepare to be able to complete an FPIC?
So
May
it
tariff
will
ba?
depend. We don't have tariff, no, but it depends on the community. Like for example, di ba, we will be going to the community. So your work and financial plan, it will show you how many will be participating in that community consultation, and that how far is the community. So your expenses for, like, if you were going to give them snacks, for that activity, that it will be computed. And if you're going to transport people from one place to the venue, then that's what you're going to spend. So it is actually a case-to-case basis.
Right. And who can they ask assistance from to know, for example, the budgetary requirements of doing an engagement with IP?
Yes, NCIP, of course, the team. There will be a team, and then we will invite someone from the community, an elder, their representative, because they're the ones who know who are the people who is going to be involved in the consultation process,
Right.
their venue. They're going to choose the venue. If they prefer the venue to be in the community, then we have to go to the community for the consultation. And as to the expenses for transportation, they will give us the idea.
Right. Thank you, Attorney. This time from Pee Wee Roldan, Artistic Director of Viva Excon Rojas. Should a work of art inspired by indigenous cultural and borrows its visual symbols and texts subject to laws under IPRA? So should a work of art inspired by our indigenous peoples and borrows its visual symbols and texts be subject to the laws under IPRA? So inspiration lang. So not an exact copy, no?
What do you mean it's just an inspiration? If there's kung may pattern, no? If there are
May pattern, for example,
that
I know
relates to our
Makanbok,
indigenous people, yes,
right,
it will be
closely
subject to
associated
IPRA.
with,
Mhm.
right,
So it's mere making it an inspiration. Like there's a math, I don't know, they're going to create a village or a house, no? Not necessarily in accordance with the house of our indigenous peoples, but
right,
the concept, the idea, there are some portions that you have to get the knowledge from the indigenous peoples. You have to research on that. You need them. You have to interview them. You have to check their own house to be inspired with what you're going to do. Then that's IKSP, because the original idea came from our indigenous peoples. Even if it's just one idea, and that you're just going to add more, that one idea from our indigenous people is already indigenous knowledge. And they
who
have
asserts that in their behalf? Like, for
NCIP.
example, somebody borrows it, maybe doesn't ask permission from NCIP or from the elders. Is there anybody who can assert in their behalf of the IPs or the IPs themselves?
Actually, anyone, because if it's a violation of the law, anyone from us, the people of the Philippines could assert that, because it's going to be because it's a crime against the state, no?
And by the way, this is also true with copyright laws, no? If there's a music, for example, or a visual art, for example, that is based on somebody else's work and is derived heavily from that somebody's work, there is really subject to copyright or intellectual property law. So by extension, this is also true with indigenous people's rights. But of course, the difference is we have laws that pertain to indigenous peoples. We have the IP concept of community, that their ideas are not owned by an individual, but by the community in the past, in the present, and even in the future, no? So very interesting. Now, this is from another artist, a filmmaker, si Emmanuel Lerona. Hello, Emmanuel. And his question is, and maybe contextualizing his question first, I am basing this on the premise that a lot of IKSPs in many hinterland IP communities in Panay. So he has that knowledge. So I'm basing this on the premise that a lot of IKSPs in many hinterland IP communities in Panay. First, is that the concept of collective knowledge is no longer true, in the sense that while the current culture bearers have acquired the knowledge from their ancestors, only these culture bearers actually bear the knowledge, and not anymore the entire community. Therefore, there is urgency in documenting the remaining undocumented IKS space of the IP communities. So maybe asking your comment on this, no? So Emmanuel Lerona says, no, basing on his not on the premise that a lot of IKS space in many hinterland IP communities in Panay, the concept of collective knowledge now is no longer true, in the sense that while the current culture bearers have acquired the knowledge from their ancestors, only these culture bearers actually bear the knowledge and not anymore the entire community. This is actually a comment from our discussion just now. Therefore, there is urgency in documenting the remaining undocumented IKS space of the IP communities. Your comment on this, attorney?
Thank you, no, for raising this, and we acknowledge the urgency, no, in documenting this, but that urgency should not go over and above the rights of our indigenous peoples. We have to document this based on the laws and our guidelines, based on respect to their indigenous, the ownership of their rights. Because if we love the indigenous peoples, we must respect them. We must be the first one to respect these rights. And it's true, no? Not everyone have the talent, and not everyone is the culture bearer, no, but it does not mean that the knowledge, they have the exclusive ownership of that. Remember that knowledge, that culture, they cannot have it on their own without the transfer from one generation to another, and they cannot be indigenous peoples without the indigenous political structure. They cannot be indigenous peoples without the time immemorial culture and possession of their lands. So if we look at that way, that if you're the only one who have the right to own your talent, no, and we will no longer recognize the indigenous knowledge, the collective ownership, then we are now shifting, no? We are no longer acknowledging that culture of our indigenous peoples, that collective ownership, which is part of their culture. We are not preserving it. In fact, we are now introducing a new concept, and it's a destruction of the old concept and old traditional, the traditional concept that we have. What we do in NCIP is that we know that during these times there are a lot of challenges, and that prevents, no, or hinders the preservation of our indigenous culture, knowledge, systems, and practices, especially the concept of ownership. And we are really struggling because there are a lot of violations, not only by non-indigenous peoples, but within the community and by our culture bearers themselves. And that's why we are very vigilant, no? And we are asking help from everyone to respect these collective rights. It is from these respective rights that our indigenous peoples, with these collective rights, that our indigenous peoples were able to preserve their culture.
So
because if they're going to be selfish, this culture, it will die. It will soon be extinct, and it will no longer be protected.
Right. So you're saying that it's not just the cultural bearers, but still it's the community that owns whatever is knowledge, whatever knowledge is transferred from one culture bearer to the other. Even if the other members of the community have no knowledge of the knowledge that the culture bearer brings, it's still owned by the community because it's created from generations past. The systems, that they have established have created this knowledge, that are shared by the culture bearers. That's a very interesting point. And again,
yes, sir. In addition, also,
yes,
yes, if I may, these traditions it is passed on from one generation to the next and to everyone. Only that there are some better dancers than others.
Right.
There are some who are good singers than others. That doesn't mean that if you're a good dancer and you're a good singer, you can own this.
Right.
Let's not deprive the community of its ownership, no? And kung maging selfish kita, it will be the start of the destruction rather than preservation of our IKSPs. And probably without the indigenous political structure, without the exclusive and unique characteristics of these people, we will have no more indigenous peoples. Wala na, because naglapta na siya. Bahay natin may nagapanag-iyasin na. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This time from Dr. Mary Ann Haro from the University of San Agustin, from my home university, our principal of the senior high school. So Dr. Haro mentions, I have secured permission from the author of the Sugidanun manuscripts to write an adaptation of 2 epics based on her manuscripts. Now, I have gone to NCIP before that and it was considered unnecessary to secure a permit since my research was based on secondary materials. However, I have not published my output, so I think Dr. Haro is being safe here until now. Now, do I have to show the completed adaptations, children's stories to NCIP before I could have them published? I think that this relates to your point earlier, attorney, no? But would you like to answer that? So Dr. Haro has made manuscripts, adaptations of 2 epics, and maybe translated them into children's stories. But does she need to present it to NCIP before they're all published?
Yes, thank you. No, but on my own opinion, because we have there are a lot of NCIP lawyers also, no, and on my own opinion, you still have to secure the IKSP to have that adaptation. Remember that book, the Sugidanun book, is not only owned by the author, but it is also owned by the community jointly with the author. So if you secure the service, the consent of the author, you must also secure the consent of the community as well as a joint owner of that book. So you have to secure to go through the IKSP process and secure the free and prior informed consent of our community through the help of NCIP. We are willing to help you. Thank you.
Because it's not owned by that author. It's owned by the community, the IKSP. Huh? Right. Thank you very much. I think it's becoming
they
clear.
own it jointly.
They own it jointly.
The output, the IKSP is owned by the community. The output is owned by the community and the author jointly.
Right.
Yes, that's
Thank you very much for pointing that out. It's owned jointly, right? So thank you very much. This comes from Carlito Kamahalan, Amalia. I am Agusan Manobo and a sculptor. I will be having my solo exhibit on textile. Now, do I need to follow the IP standard or rules? Am I excused from the penalty? So my solo exhibit on textile. Do I need to follow the IP standard or rules? Am I excused for penalty? This is from an Agusan Manobo.
Is the work IP related? Is it the IKSP? But if it's your work as a sculpture, personally, without taking it from your culture as a Manobo, then you can on your own. But if there's a Manobo element there, like you took that from something, like you sculpt something, you're based on the idea of your based on the culture nga may like there's one part kang sa story, based sa story nyo, based sa culture nyo, then you have to secure the consent of the community. But if it's not related to you being a Manobo, no, then you can have your own exhibit,
right,
without the consent of the community.
Right. There's a question from Rock Drilon, no? One of our celebrated painters. A community of artists, AVAC, is working on a mural with the Panay Bukidnun. So it's a collaboration of the local folks and the indigenous peoples. Is that okay? Is that collaboration okay? Or do they need permissions from somebody?
That's okay, but as we have said, although we have the free and prior informed consent and they have consented to it, still you have to coordinate with NCIP because you have to secure the certification precondition. The certification precondition assures us that the consent was given freely,
Free, informed, and
without
prior
any,
consent.
yes, and
Right.
it's complete. So it's
Right.
the duty of the NCIP to make sure that there was no undue influence on the consent
Right.
given. Yes,
Right.
and that the contents is complete and the rights of the indigenous peoples are protected through the memorandum of agreement.
Right.
That's why we intervened, because we know that our community, most of them, they are not yet let's say to ensure lang na they are truly protected.
Right.
So we have to intervene.
So even if there's a collaboration, and even if the IP works on the collaboration wholeheartedly and freely, there is still a need, no, for NCIP to know whether indeed there was free, prior, and is it written consent as well? Because it is enshrined in a memorandum, no? It's placed in a memorandum of agreement.
And it will be evidenced by a certification precondition. That certification precondition is like a certification that there was a free and prior informed consent.
Right.
It was secured in accordance with the law and our
Thank you very
guidelines.
much, Attorney.
Thank
You are really guiding a lot of artists and creatives here who I know with all our good intentions really just want to also present to the generations to come the work of our indigenous peoples. But like what you've mentioned earlier, we do have to respect their rights, no? Because they are a community then, now, and in the future. Right, there's another question, and this is, I think, very popular across the islands, the Visayas, considering that we are, and not only that, the whole archipelago for that matter. What are your recommendations on local festivals using IP identities and practices? No, so I mean, I'm just thinking here of Ati-Atihan, I'm just thinking here of Dinagyang, which we're working on, among others, no, among other festivals, and even the Panay Bukidnun Festival in Kalinog, for example. So what are your recommendations on local festivals using IP identities and practices?
So it's a difficult question. Anyway, I'll just give my own personal recommendation. Yeah, and we are very thankful that we acknowledge and appreciate the indigenous culture now of our indigenous peoples, and probably in celebrating the indigenous culture that we have. First, in view of the respect to them, we must be sensitive on how to use these materials. For example, we'll just we sensitive sa culture and we use it in accordance with the culture and tradition. As said earlier by Taimolok, no, they want it in a genuine way. Without and if we are going to have an adaptation, we should secure their consent if they will allow that or not, because they want to keep it the way their ancestors have used it.
In your engagement, thank you. In your engagement with them, are the indigenous peoples comfortable with other peoples representing them in the festival? I mean, and let me just be direct to the point. No? Dinagyang, for example, no, there's in the past there's been a lot of representation of the lowlanders or of our locals, of our artists, no, representing the Ati in the festival. Are they comfortable with that? Do we need to have an engagement with NCIP before those depictions?
So far, we have no complaints
Mm.
from our indigenous people, especially the Ati,
Right.
as to, in fact, they're proud. Our indigenous
Mm.
peoples are proud that
Okay.
we are acknowledging their culture.
Right.
Yes.
Because that's the struggle, whether you do not represent them at all because it's so complicated, so they are lost in memory, no, if they are not put also in the mainstream, if they're not also acknowledged, no. Right. Thank you very
Probably
much.
we can just invite in one of our festivities, we can invite them to perform the genuine.
Right.
So yeah, para at
Right.
least they will see, no, the original
Right.
version of the dances of
Right.
our arty.
In fact, in 2020 and in 2021, we invited them to dance in the streets. And then I was talking to one of the members of the Panay Bukidnun. He was an elderly fellow, and he was saying, di na ko guro maglakat sa dalan. I don't have to go around the streets because I'm already old, no? Before you know it, he was already in the streets and then walking with everybody, with the Panay Bukidnun and the Ati, because he cannot contain his joy of being acknowledged, no, and being validated nga ilang atingol, their own voice is heard and in their own images are seen, not by anybody else, but sila gid, the Panay Bukidnon and the Ati themselves, no. All right, here's an interesting question. Were there cases filed on those violating IPRA in the past? I know that our participant, si Rara Bidauri Limoso Ramirez, would like to ask if you could mention some, please, but maybe I'm not sure if you would like to keep their identities, but maybe have there been cases? What issues were raised in these particular cases?
Yeah, in the past, no, well, I've been in NCIP for like 6 years. So I cannot really tell in the past, no. But for now, our chairperson is very vigilant on this, and he has given instructions to our legal officers to file cases against violators of IPRA. And in fact, we are working now in filing. We give demand, and if you can comply, then probably we will not file. But if you are really but if the applicant is really stubborn, we will be compelled to file a case. And there's one case that we are working now, and I'd like to keep
Itago
it.
na lang natin sa pangalan. We're not disclosing it now, no?
Yes,
but
definitely we will notify first, no. We are open for especially if the community is open for conciliation and for correcting this because we understand the predicament of our researchers. We understand the passion that they have, no, but we have to comply with what's incumbent under the law. Thank you.
Thank you very
It's
much.
essential. Thank you.
I hope you don't mind all these questions, attorney, no? Your talk, no? Short and sweet as it was, really open up a lot of questions, because of course these are questions that we have perhaps kept throughout the years, and we have been triggered, no, by your presentation earlier, and to ask these questions for the benefit of all. Now, here's a question from our organizers. How is intellectual property, no, the private and legal ownership of it, explained to the indigenous peoples, no, when the intellectual property is owned by the community? So how is in intellectual property, the private and legal ownership of that property, explained to indigenous peoples when the intellectual property is owned by the community? Do they have knowledge of this? Is this explained to them well?
Thank you. Actually, that is their culture. It is the law that we have right now, the collective ownership. It did not come from us. It came from our indigenous peoples themselves.
Right.
No, although syempre the new generations probably will not know about it. But definitely, since time immemorial, it is the culture, it is the tradition of our indigenous peoples. It is their practice. It's always collective. it's only recently that most of them are not practicing that. And what we want is to preserve that and to keep it that way. That's why we're working hard on that, because it's been since the 500 years since we were being colonized, and yes, and the also the commodification of culture and the lands, no, and it's hard, no, to maintain that tradition, especially now, no, now we are all struggling even within the community.
Right.
Thank you.
Here's another question also from our organizers regarding who constitutes as indigenous people. Now, do children of younger generations who move to urban centers, and there are some of them, who do not necessarily practice the IKSP because of modernization, are they considered IPs by virtue of their parentage, or did they lose their IP identity as they move from one culture to another?
Yeah, another difficult question. Now, yes, for us, we still consider them, no, especially in the securing the certificate of confirmation. But definitely they must have that culture. Otherwise, you cannot be called a member of the indigenous peoples without practicing the culture. How could you be called a member of the indigenous cultures without the culture that defines the very essence of your group? So during our interview with them, we asked them, do you know your elders and leaders? So it's not enough that you have the blood, because if it's based on blood, then probably all of us are indigenous peoples.
Right.
Yes, it should always be based on the culture that that the community or that person was able to retain distinctly from all others. Because if it's not distinct, then the definition in the IPRA is it's strictly on the culture, not by blood.
Can an IP voluntarily revoke his rights or his identity?
Well,
I will stop being an IP. I won't consider myself as an IP, and therefore I will not anymore respect the rights of an IP, or my rights as IP be respected. Is that even possible?
Yeah, actually, the definition of indigenous peoples earlier is just shortcut, basic lang to ginhatag ko. But if we go into the wordings kita na of sa IPRA, it says there, those who have ascribed themselves and people ascribe them to be indigenous people. So you have to acknowledge, you have to identify yourself as a member of indigenous peoples, even if people look at you as a member of indigenous people, but you yourself, you don't identify yourself to be a member of the indigenous peoples, then you cannot be a member thereof, because it has to be through self-ascription and ascription by others.
Right. Thank you very much. Wow. Maybe the last question. No, there have been, grabe, attorney, no? There's a stretch of questions in this. We can just actually really talk a lot more about this, because after all, the IPs have been here for, again, more than 500 years, no? Half a millennia. Now, are there instances or actions mentioned classified as cultural? Are these instances or actions mentioned classified as cultural appropriation? I think in relation to siguro the performance, no, of indigenous culture, no, are these instances or actions mentioned as classified cultural appropriation? How do we ensure that cultural appropriation is not used as an excuse by artists and organizers of these festivals? Okay, so in relation to the festivals naman. So do you think that these festivals are culturally appropriating the work of our indigenous peoples, or excuse lang ito ng ating mga organizers and artists? How do we ensure that there is proper cultural appropriation?
Thank you, no? But I guess the festivals, they just mere celebrations, no? General celebrations and not particular to a certain ICCs, no? Because so when we say cultural appropriation, we have first to identify from which it belongs.
Right.
Without knowing kung diin siya, then there will be no intellectual property. It's a basic, no? So you have to show first that you are the original before we can say that we have appropriated your originality and your culture. Okay. So if it's so general, like it belongs to all of us because we just depicting the history, like for example the Dinagyang, although there are artists there, I believe it's just we are just celebrating the arrival of the Santo Niño, no, from our artists. So we are actually celebrating the event,
Right.
not the particular culture, although involved siya, no?
Right.
That's
Right.
why. So it's a case-to-case basis of how it's on how we use it and how we ano ang purpose naton in celebrating that will classify it whether it's cultural appropriation or not. But generally, if it's so general, I believe that there will be no cultural appropriation.
And of course, the IPs will also raise concerns, no, if there is a violation of our laws and of course their cultural inappropriation. In fact, when we were doing Dinagyang just 2 years back, no, when it was still live, I was very worried of an ati or a Panay Bukidnun carrying the Santo Niño because I was thinking maybe it's a violation of their right or maybe it's putting down who they are because you have an indigenous person carrying a religious symbol that's pre-colonial, no? But then they said this is amo ni pagtuo, this is our faith. So why will you deprive us of carrying the Santo Niño? So I'm like, okay, so feel free to dance with the Santo Niño because many of them are already Catholics and and also revered and adore the Santo Niño. No? So it's their own expression. So that's allowed also.
And if I may have an additional input, no, although we want to preserve the indigenous culture, it is also vibrant and evolving. It adapts. That's why it's resilient. So there are portions that we retain and slowly it evolves, it adapts to the new setup. That's why we have our indigenous people believing in this mariit, sacred places, sacred grounds, and yet some of them they are already they have this religion believing in the Lord. The Spanish, some of them there are Roman Catholics also.
Right. Thank you very much, Attorney. This has been an enriching discussion about our roots and where our new routes will take us. Before we wrap up, may I ask you some concluding statements to all our creatives, to all our researchers, and even to the IPs, no? Your concluding statements as we go into the Golden Realms.
Thank you so much, sir, for inviting us and for the Japan Foundation and for ThriveArt, for this opportunity to share our knowledge, And we really appreciate that all our artists. We are thankful and we appreciate your work and your efforts for our indigenous peoples. But as I have said, if we love the indigenous peoples, we must respect them. That's because there is no love without respect. So we hope that you join us in protecting and promoting the rights of our indigenous peoples. This undertaking, we cannot do it alone. We need your help. We need to work together for our indigenous peoples. And we are looking forward to be working with you on your activities, your artworks, and we are also excited to have them, to share them with everyone in the whole world. No? Thank you very much, sir. In behalf of our Regional Director, Agosto B. Maglungsod, Regional Director of NCIP Region 6 and 7, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Madamo gid nga salamat, Attorney Mary Genevieve Tingson-Wuthrich, for allowing us to go into the golden realms, looking back with respect to our indigenous peoples and moving forward, no, as we look into brighter days ahead of us. Again, bringing with us our love for where we came from, our roots. No, madamo gid nga salamat, Attorney Mary Genevieve Tingson-Wuthrich. Thank you very much. And now, dear friends, we have now come to an end with our second talk for this webinar series. Thank you to all of our participants for being with us, and Attorney Wuthrich for sharing her expertise on intellectual property rights and indigenous peoples' rights. We would also like to thank our partner, the Japan Foundation Manila, for making this event possible as part of the Japan Foundation's Asian Literature Project, YOMU. Please join us for the third webinar on November 13, 2021 about oral traditions in Asia with Professor Norio Akasaka and other Filipino folklorists. Also, follow the Japan Foundation Manila and ThriveArt Projects on our social media to stay updated about the 3 upcoming webinars, as well as the launch of the special Golden Realms Sugidanun manga by Ilonggo artists in December. Participants are encouraged to answer our questionnaire and like our social media pages. Please scan the QR link or follow this link, which we have also posted in the comments. Your answers will help us with planning our future events. Thank you again for joining Golden Realms, and we hope to see you in the next talk. Arigatou gozaimasu. Maraming salamat. Rakuging salamat sa tanan. Maayong aga.
Before we wrap up, I would like to acknowledge the presence as well of Tai Mulok, who was able to join us today.
Tai Mulok, maayong aga sa imo, maayong adlaw sa imo. Madamo nga salamat sa imo nga sugidanon. Palakpakan naton si Tai Mulok o maka-react man kita sa aton nga mga screen sa madamo gid nga salamat. Madamo nga salamat. And now back to our organizers.
Tai Mulok, would you like to share a message? You can unmute po.
Tai Mulok, may gusto kang ihambal sa aton nga mga bisita diri? Would you like to share something? Do gwapo kita subong hao. May mensahe ikaw para sa aton tanan? Do you have a message for us? Tai Mulok, sige. Maghambal ikaw.
Quality log gulay hambal ko. Ang mensahe ko lang nga pasalamat ako kay may naga-research nga sa pinakadlaw kung madura pa ako sa kalibutan. Pwede makamaan man explicar ka natawag na tugidanan kung ano ang nagkatabo sa unang nga panahon. Ang mahambal ko lang nga kung sino man ang nag-research kung ipa-disciplinan das pinakadlaw, ang gusto ko lang ikuri ko anay kag antes nga ilibro ng ta para nga sigurado na hindi
mamangkot gid si imo. Malisin siya gid. So, hambal ni Tai Mulok, for those who want to research, first he acknowledges and he thanks everyone for having interest on the Panay Bukidnun and for doing researches on the Panay Bukidnun. But of course, he also encourages everybody to make sure that they ask permission from the NCIP and of course the indigenous peoples like si Tay Mulok, the Council of Elders, before we engage the indigenous peoples and publish researches based on them. So ginambal ko lang sila Tay Mulok nga dapat malisensya sila sa imo kay ini ang imo nga sugidanon, imo ni kag iya sang komunidad sang aton nga Panay Bukidnun.
Ang ulan, salamat din.
Madamo man nga salamat. Madamo gid nga salamat kag katahom gid sang imong limog, katahom gid sang imong tingog kagina. Nagpresentar ikaw sang sugidanon, particularly tuhoy sa Tarangban kagina amon na pamatian. So thank you very much, and to each and everyone who have joined us or are still joining us, we really invite you to join more of our projects and more of our webinar series, and we look forward to your engagement. Madamo gid nga salamat.
Madamo salamat.